Did you think a maid's hands could hold a secret that powerful? The question hung in the air like a spark over dry wood, and in the grand marble hall of the Whitmore estate, everyone was about to learn the answer. Before dawn had fully touched the wide windows, Elena Brooks stood near the nursery door with a silver tray in her hands, her posture calm, her face composed, and her dark eyes fixed on the tiny baby crying behind the glass. She had been hired only 3 weeks ago, the newest in a long line of staff who came and went through this house of polished floors, imported flowers, and rules so strict they were whispered rather than spoken. The child's cries had started again, thin and tired, the kind that reached straight through the walls and settled in the chest. Elena listened for a moment, then glanced down the hallway, where the portraits of stern ancestors watched in silence, and the framed clocks marked each expensive second with a soft, precise tick. She should have kept walking. That was what every employee knew in a house like this. Never step outside your place. Never question the order of things. Never let pity make decisions for you. But Elena had lived long enough to understand that sometimes a person's place in the world mattered less than what kind of heart they carried into it. She turned the nursery handle slowly, careful not to disturb the morning quiet, and stepped inside. The room was bathed in pale gold light, soft curtains moving in the air from a cracked window, toys lined neatly along the wall, and a rocking chair sitting still in the corner like it was waiting for someone who never came. In the crib, little Noah Whitmore was red-faced and exhausted, his tiny fists opening and closing as he cried with the helpless urgency only a hungry infant could know. Elena's expression softened at once. She set the tray down, checked the bottle warming on the side table, and then paused, her brows drawing together with concern. Something was wrong. Noah was fed on schedule, yet his cries had grown weaker over the past 2 mornings, not louder. She lifted him gently, supporting his head with a practiced ease that came from years of helping raise younger cousins back in Georgia, and held him close enough to feel the fragile heat of his little body. "It's all right, baby," she whispered, her voice low and steady, almost musical in the quiet room. "I've got you." The baby's crying faltered for a second, then eased into soft, broken sounds as his breathing slowed against her shoulder. Elena stood there in the sunlight, swaying just enough to soothe him, unaware that the nursery door had opened behind her, and that the man who owned this house had just come to a stop in the doorway. Daniel Whitmore had expected to find a quiet nursery and a maid doing her job. Instead, he stood in the doorway and watched Elena Brooks gently rock his son as if she had been doing it for years. The room was washed in pale morning light, the kind that made everything look softer than it really was, and for a moment he said nothing at all. Noah had been crying for nearly an hour before Elena picked him up, and now the baby was no longer gasping for breath between sobs. He rested against her shoulder, small fingers curled weakly into the fabric of her blouse, his face finally calm. Daniel had seen doctors, consultants, and nurses soothe his child before, but never like this. Never with such instinct. Never with such patience. Elena sensed him before she turned. Her body stiffened only slightly, but she did not panic. She simply adjusted the baby in her arms and looked over her shoulder, her expression respectful, though her eyes held a quiet steadiness that made him pause. "Mr. Whitmore," she said softly, careful not to wake Noah, "I hope you do not mind." He was struggling to settle. Daniel did not answer right away. His gaze moved from her face to the baby, then to the empty bottle on the side table, then back again. The polished nursery seemed suddenly smaller, as if the air itself had tightened around the moment. Elena lowered her voice. "He would not take the bottle at first, but he seems better now." There was no defensiveness in her tone, no attempt to explain more than necessary, only calm concern. That unsettled him more than if she had stammered or made excuses. Daniel stepped farther into the room, slow and controlled, his presence filling the space without a sound. He was still in his dark suit, his tie loosened at the collar, the kind of man whose silence carried more weight than most people's threats. Yet when he looked at his son, something in his face changed. Noah was still in Elena's arms, breathing evenly now, his cheek pressed against her shoulder as though he trusted her completely. Daniel had not expected that. He had not expected to feel a sharp, almost unfamiliar ache in his chest at the sight of it. "How long has he been crying?" he asked. Elena hesitated only a fraction before answering. "Since before sunrise, sir." Daniel's jaw tightened. He glanced toward the monitor, then the bottle, then the tiny blanket folded at the edge of the crib. Everything was in order. Everything, except the way his son had been calming down in the arms of a woman he had hired only weeks ago. "You did not call for anyone?" he asked. "I did not think that would help," Elena said. He needed to be held. The answer was so simple that it made him look at her differently. Not as an employee. Not as a temporary presence in his house. Something in her manner suggested a kind of knowledge that could not be taught in training manuals or learned from instructions. It was quiet. It was human. And Noah somehow had recognized it before Daniel had. Daniel took another step closer, his eyes fixed on the child. "Hand him to me," he said, though his voice was not unkind. Elena looked at him, then at Noah, and for one suspended second it seemed as if she might hesitate. But when she carefully shifted the baby into his arms, Noah made a small sound, not distressed, just uncertain. Daniel held him awkwardly at first, one large hand supporting the back of the infant's head, the other bracing his tiny body against his chest. Elena watched without judgment, ready to steady the baby if needed. That too struck him. She was not afraid to let him take over, but she was not rushing to leave either. She simply stood there, patient and composed, as though she understood that this moment mattered. Noah stirred once, then settled again, though not as fully as before. Daniel looked down at his son, then back at Elena, and something unspoken passed between them in the silence. He did not yet know why she had such a calming effect on the child, only that she did. And in that private, fragile quiet, before either of them said another word, Daniel Whitmore realized that his house had just changed in a way he could not ignore. Daniel did not move at first. He remained in the nursery doorway with his hand still resting on the frame, watching Elena Brooks stand beside the rocking chair as if she belonged there more than anyone else in the house. The morning light touched the edges of her face and turned the room soft, but it did nothing to soften the thought pressing through him. His son had been inconsolable less than 10 minutes ago, and now the child was quiet, his small body finally loose with exhaustion instead of panic. Daniel had seen doctors, nannies, and specialists come and go with polished assurances and expensive language. None of them had done what Elena had done with nothing more than patience, a steady voice, and a way of holding Noah that made him feel safe. Elena folded her hands in front of her and kept her eyes on the baby, not on Daniel. That restraint mattered more than he wanted to admit. She was not fishing for praise. She was not waiting to be noticed. She was simply attentive, as though the child in her arms had become the only thing in the room that mattered. Daniel stepped inside and closed the door behind him with quiet care. The sound was barely there, yet Elena still looked up at once, alert but not startled. He had expected fear or flustered apologies, or the kind of nervousness that usually came with being caught alone with the boss's son. Instead, she met his gaze with calm eyes and a face that held no trace of panic. "How did you do that?" he asked, his voice lower than he intended. Elena glanced down at Noah, who had one tiny fist curled against her sleeve. "He was overwhelmed," she said simply. "Sometimes they do not need more noise. They just need to know somebody is not going to leave them." Daniel felt that answer settle somewhere deep in him. It was too direct to ignore and too honest to dismiss. He looked at his son, then back at her. "And you knew that right away?" "I recognized the signs," she replied. There was nothing boastful in her tone, only quiet certainty. Daniel studied her for another second, noting the careful way she stood, the worn but clean shoes, the sleeves rolled neatly at her wrists, the small silver cross at her throat. She looked nothing like the kind of woman who would make him stop and question his own house, and yet she had done exactly that. Noah stirred, making a soft sound against her shoulder, and Elena adjusted her hold with practiced ease. Daniel watched the motion and realized it was not random. It was instinct. Familiar. The kind of movement no one learned from a handbook. Something in his chest tightened, not with suspicion, but with a strange, uneasy recognition. He had spent months feeling like every room in his home was built around his fear of failing his son. Now, standing in that quiet nursery, he was looking at a woman who had somehow stepped into that fear and made it smaller. "You have children?" he asked before he could stop himself. Elena's expression changed only slightly, but it was enough. Her eyes dipped for the briefest moment, and when she answered, her voice stayed even. I did. The room seemed to hold its breath. Daniel did not push. He simply waited, because something in the way she had said it told him the sentence carried more weight than she wanted to place on the air. Elena drew in a slow breath and kept her gaze on Noah. My daughter passed away 2 years ago, she said, each word measured and clear, as if she had learned long ago that truth was easier to carry when it was spoken carefully. She was only 3. After that, I could not be around a crying baby without feeling everything all over again. I thought I was finished working with children. Daniel said nothing. He felt the words land with a quiet force that made the whole room seem stiller than before. Elena continued, but only after a pause, her thumb brushing once over Noah's blanket. Then I heard him crying this morning, and I knew that sound. Not because it was the same, but because grief recognizes grief. Sometimes pain does not want to be solved. It only wants to be answered. Daniel looked at her differently then. The woman standing in front of him was not just a maid who had soothed his son. She was someone who had carried loss into this house and without asking permission, turned it into comfort. Noah made a sleepy little sigh and settled deeper into her arms. Elena smiled faintly, but there was sadness in it too. He reminds me of her, she said, almost to herself. Daniel felt the sentence strike harder than anything else she had said. For a long moment, he did not trust himself to speak. The nursery seemed filled with morning light and old grief, and the fragile sound of a baby breathing in peace. At last, Daniel looked at Elena and heard his own voice come out calmer than he felt. You did not have to stay in here, he said. You could have called for help. Elena lifted her eyes to his at last. He needed help sooner than that. The answer was so plain, so unadorned, that Daniel had no defense against it. He looked at Noah, then back at the woman who had given his son something he had not been able to give him himself in that moment. Trust. And in the silence that followed, Daniel Whitmore understood that the most important person in his house had not arrived with a formal recommendation or a perfect resume. She had arrived with a broken heart, and somehow that was exactly what his son had recognized first. Daniel remained in the nursery doorway for a moment longer, watching Elena Brooks sit beside Noah with her hands folded loosely in her lap, as if she understood that sudden movements could break the spell of calm she had created. The room was still warm with late morning light, and the pale curtains moved gently near the open window, carrying in the faint sound of tires on gravel from the driveway outside. Noah had drifted into a light sleep against the cushions of the rocking chair. His small fingers curled around the edge of the blanket Elena had tucked around him with such quiet care that Daniel found himself noticing every detail of it. No one had ever moved through his house with that kind of patience. No one had ever looked at his son with that kind of steady tenderness either. Elena glanced up when she felt his gaze, and something in her expression shifted only slightly, as if she were already preparing to explain herself even though she had done nothing wrong. Daniel stepped inside and closed the door with more care than he expected from himself. He stayed calm, he said at last, his voice lower than before. Elena looked back at Noah and nodded once. He was tired, she replied. Sometimes tired children do not need more noise. They need someone to stay. The answer settled between them, simple and unguarded, and Daniel felt the words reach places in him he usually kept locked away. He had spent years building order, schedules, and systems that could control nearly everything in his life. Yet one exhausted child and one quiet woman had managed to undo that certainty in less than an hour. You seem to know that instinctively, he said. Elena gave a faint, almost self-conscious smile. I have spent enough time around children to know when they are asking for comfort instead of attention. Daniel studied her for a moment, noticing the careful way she held herself, the restraint in her posture, the faint shadows beneath her eyes that suggested long days and even longer nights. There was nothing careless about her, nothing performative. She was not trying to impress him. She was simply there, present in the moment, offering something his house had been missing without asking for recognition. A quiet knock sounded at the nursery door before Mrs. Langley, the housekeeper, entered with a folded white towel in her hands and a look that suggested she had been waiting outside long enough to realize something unusual had happened. Her eyes moved from Noah to Elena, then to Daniel, and she seemed to understand enough to stay polite. Mr. Whitmore, she said softly. The pediatrician called back. He can come by this afternoon if you still want him to. Daniel nodded absently, but his attention stayed on Elena. Yes. Arrange it. Mrs. Langley gave a small nod and left them alone again, the door closing behind her with a hush that made the room feel even more private. Daniel looked at the woman beside his son and asked the question that had been forming since he first saw her in the doorway. Why did you really take this job, Elena? Her eyes lifted slowly to his, and for the first time since he had met her, the calm in her face did not hide everything. Because I needed work, she said. Then after a brief pause she added, and because I thought I could be useful here. Daniel did not answer right away. He had the sudden uncomfortable sense that she had not come to him for charity, pity, or rescue. She had come because she was willing to earn her place in a house that had not yet given her one. That alone changed the way he saw her. Then Noah stirred, letting out a soft sound in his sleep, and Elena moved almost automatically, adjusting the blanket with a tenderness so natural it seemed older than memory. Daniel watched the gesture and felt a thought rise in him, quiet but undeniable. He had hired a maid. But what he seemed to have standing in his nursery was something far more difficult to define, and far more important to ignore. Daniel stood in the nursery doorway long enough to notice the smallest things. The way Elena kept one hand resting lightly on Noah's back, the way she did not crowd him, and the way his son leaned toward her as if he already knew he was safe. The late morning light spilled across the pale rug, turning the soft edges of the room golden, and for a moment the whole house seemed to hold its breath. Elena did not look up right away. She was focused on Noah, speaking to him in a voice so calm and steady that even Daniel felt his own shoulders loosen without meaning to. When she finally glanced toward the doorway, there was no panic in her expression, no guilt, no performative obedience, just quiet awareness. He is sleeping better when he is not fighting the silence, she said softly, as if she were explaining something simple, something that should have been obvious to everyone. Daniel's eyes moved from her face to his son's relaxed hand curled against the blanket, and then back again. You have a way with him, he said. Elena lowered her gaze for a second, as though the compliment made her uncomfortable. I have learned to listen, she replied. It was a small answer, but it carried weight. Daniel stepped into the room and closed the door behind him with care, the soft click sounding louder than it should have in that peaceful hush. Noah did not wake. Elena remained still. Most people try to fix him before they understand him, Daniel said, his voice lower now, more thoughtful than sharp. You did not do that. He does not need to be fixed, Elena answered, and the simple certainty in her tone made Daniel look at her more closely. He needs patience. And routine. And for the people around him to stop treating his differences like an inconvenience. The words landed with a quiet force. Daniel had heard doctors, therapists, and advisors speak about his son in polished language that never reached the truth. Elena had said more in a few seconds than any of them had managed in weeks. He looked at her hands then, roughened by work, careful in their stillness, and he thought about all the times he had mistaken competence for distance, efficiency for care. There was nothing cold in Elena Brookside. Nothing rehearsed. She simply gave Noah what he needed without asking permission for kindness. Did you learn that from training? He asked. Elena shook her head. No. From life. The answer was brief, but Daniel heard the edge beneath it, the part she had not offered. There was history there and pain, and something she had carried alone for far too long. He should have stopped there. He knew that. Yet he found himself asking, almost against his own judgment, "What happened to you?" Elena's breath caught so subtly that he might have missed it if he had not been watching so carefully. Her eyes moved to Noah first, then to the window, where the curtain stirred with the breeze coming in from the open glass. For a long moment she said nothing at all. Then she smoothed her hand over the blanket and whispered, "I lost someone I was supposed to protect." Daniel did not speak. The silence in the nursery changed shape around those words. It was no longer merely quiet. It was intimate, fragile, and impossible to ignore. Elena continued in the same low voice, never raising her eyes fully to his. After that, I could not stand by and do nothing for a child who was hurting. The honesty of it struck him harder than any polished explanation could have. She had not been trying to impress him. She had not been trying to win sympathy. She had been telling the truth because the truth was all she had left that still felt clean. Daniel glanced down at Noah again, asleep and peaceful in a way he had not seen in months, and then back to Elena, who sat there with such quiet restraint that it seemed almost like an act of courage. Something in him shifted. Not softening exactly. Something more permanent. The kind of shift that came when a man realized the person he had hired to manage a room had already begun to heal the center of his home. He lowered himself into the chair across from her, no longer standing above the moment but within it. "If you are going to keep helping him," he said, "then I need to know who I am trusting." Elena met his gaze at last, and there was no fear in it, only tired dignity and a guarded kind of hope. "My name is Elena Brookside," she said, "and I am exactly what your son needed before he even knew how to ask for it." Daniel held her gaze for a long second, then looked back at Noah, whose breathing had settled into the deep, even rhythm of true rest. The room remained still, but the meaning of that stillness had changed. He had invited a maid into his home. What he was beginning to understand in the quietest part of the afternoon was that she had brought something into his life that no amount of money had ever been able to buy. By the time the afternoon light began to fade, Daniel had already learned something important about his own house. The quiet no longer belonged to him alone. He stood in the hallway outside the nursery, hearing only the soft rhythm of Noah's breathing and the faint rustle of Elena's movement as she straightened a blanket with careful hands. Nothing about the scene demanded attention, and yet everything about it held him there. Elena did not perform care. She simply gave it the way some people breathe without thinking. Noah had finally settled, his small face relaxed in sleep, one hand loosely curled near his cheek, and the sight struck Daniel harder than he expected. For weeks, the child had resisted comfort from everyone who tried. Doctors had offered explanations, specialists had offered schedules, and the house had offered expensive silence. None of it had reached him the way Elena had in less than an hour. She sat now in the armchair near the window, not making herself comfortable so much as making herself useful, one hand still resting lightly near Noah in case he stirred. When she noticed Daniel watching, she did not jump or shrink back. She only lifted her eyes with a calm so steady it almost unsettled him. "He is asleep," she said softly. "For now at least." Daniel stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a sound so gentle it barely registered. The nursery was washed in the last warm wash of daylight, pale gold touching the shelves, the rocking chair, the edge of the crib. It made Elena look even more composed, more real, as if she belonged in the stillness in a way he did not yet understand. He looked from her to his son, then back again. "He does not do that," he said, his voice lower than before, almost as if speaking too loudly might break whatever fragile peace had taken shape. Elena's expression did not change. "Children often need the right kind of quiet before they can trust it," she replied. Daniel considered that. He had spent years building a world that obeyed schedules, contracts, and consequences. Quiet in his life usually meant control. But this was different. This quiet felt earned. It felt protected. It felt like something tender had entered the house and refused to leave until it made room for itself. He moved closer to the crib and looked down at Noah, studying the loosened tension in the boy's small shoulders. "I have never seen him relax this quickly with anyone," Daniel said. Elena glanced toward the child, and for a moment something almost imperceptible passed across her face, a trace of sorrow too private to name. "Sometimes," she said, "a child recognizes safety before he can explain it." Daniel looked at her more carefully then, not as an employee, but as the woman who had brought that safety with her into a home that had not known it in a long time. He could see now that she was tired in a way sleep could not fix, the kind of exhaustion that came from carrying too much for too long. Yet there was no bitterness in her posture, only discipline and grace. "You have experience with children," he said. It was not quite a question. Elena folded her hands in her lap. "Enough to know that they are honest about what they feel," she answered. Daniel let that sit between them. Noah stirred once, then settled again, and Elena did not move except to adjust the blanket by an inch. Daniel noticed how natural it looked, how little effort she made to be noticed, and how impossible it was now to ignore her. Whatever he had hired her for had already become something else. Not a task. Not a formality. something quieter and far more serious. He did not yet know what place she would hold in his life, but he knew with sudden clarity that she would not remain invisible for long. Before the afternoon could fully settle, Daniel Whitmore found himself standing in the hallway again, listening to the quiet that had grown around his nursery like something fragile and new. Inside, Noah was no longer restless. His breathing had softened into a steady rhythm, and Elena Brooke was still in the chair by the crib, one hand resting lightly on the blanket as if she understood that even sleep could feel uncertain in a house that had spent too long without peace. Daniel watched her for a moment before stepping inside, his shoes silent against the polished floor. Elena looked up at him at once, not startled, only attentive, as though she had been expecting the world to ask something of her again. "He finally settled," she said in a calm voice, her eyes moving briefly to the child and then back to Daniel. "He does that when he feels safe." The words landed with a weight Daniel had not expected. Safe was not a word that belonged easily in his home. His house had been expensive, orderly, and quiet, but never safe in the way she meant it. He looked at Noah, then at Elena, and realized that the change in the room had not come from the furniture, the light, or the silence. It had come from her presence. "You make that sound simple," he said, keeping his voice low. Elena gave the smallest smile, the kind that did not ask for attention. "Children usually are simple. People are the ones who make everything harder." Daniel almost answered, but stopped himself. There was too much truth in that sentence to dismiss it quickly. He moved closer to the crib and lowered his gaze to his son, who had one tiny hand curled near his cheek. For the first time in a long time, Daniel felt something loosen in his chest, a restraint he had worn so long that he had nearly mistaken it for strength. Elena stood slowly, smoothing the front of her dress with careful fingers. She did not crowd him, did not try to fill the space with words. She only waited, patient and steady, as if she had already learned that trust could not be forced into existence. "I should get dinner started soon," she said. "If that is all right." Daniel glanced at her, then back at Noah. The question should have been simple. Instead, it carried the quiet implication that she was already thinking beyond her own task, already shaping the room around the needs of others without expecting praise. "It is more than all right," he said. Elena nodded once and started toward the door, but Daniel spoke before she could leave. "Elena." She paused and turned back. He studied her face, the calm composure, the tiredness she still did not seem willing to admit, and the strange dignity she wore as naturally as breathing. "Noah responds to you," he said. "I have noticed." Elena's expression shifted only slightly, but he saw it. Recognition. Not pride. Not surprise. Something quieter. "He is a very observant little boy," she replied. Daniel let out a breath that was almost a laugh, though there was no humor in it. "So are you." For the first time since she had entered his home, Elena seemed unsure what to do with the compliment, and that small hesitation told Daniel more than a polished response ever could have. She lowered her eyes for a moment, then looked back at him with a steadiness that did not waver. "I learned a long time ago that people remember how you make them feel," she said. Daniel did not move. Those words stayed with him as she left the nursery, soft footsteps fading down the hall while the afternoon light shifted across the room and turned everything gold and still. He remained by the crib, staring at his sleeping son, but his thoughts were no longer on schedules or appointments or the endless demands of the day. They were on the woman who had entered his house with no ceremony and quietly changed the shape of it. And somewhere beneath the silence, Daniel Whitmore understood that some arrivals were never ordinary, because they did not simply enter a home. They altered the people inside it. By the time the evening settled over the Whitmore house, the nursery felt different from the way it had that morning. The air was softer now, the kind of quiet that did not feel empty but earned. Daniel stood in the doorway for a moment, watching Elena gather Noah's blanket with careful hands while the baby slept with his face turned toward her side of the chair, calm in a way he rarely was for anyone else. Daniel had spent years measuring people by what they could do, what they could cost, and what they could prove. Elena Brooks had not tried to impress him once, and yet she had done more for his son in a single afternoon than some people had managed in months. When she rose, Noah stirred just enough to make a small sound in his sleep, and Elena paused instantly, one hand hovering over the crib until his breathing settled again. That single movement, restrained and instinctive, struck Daniel harder than he expected. It was not duty. It was not performance. It was care so natural it seemed to come from a place deeper than habit. "He sleeps better when the room is quiet," Elena said in a low voice, as if she were speaking to the room itself. "Not because it is silent, but because he knows someone is still here." Daniel looked at her then, really looked at her, and something in his chest tightened with recognition he could not yet name. She had not spoken much about herself, and he had not asked, but there was a patience in her that suggested years of learning how to survive disappointment without letting it harden her. "You make this place feel calmer," he said. The words were simple, but they seemed to catch her off guard. Elena folded the blanket once more and met his eyes with a quiet composure that made the room feel even stiller. "Children notice what adults pretend not to," she replied. "They know when a house is tired." Daniel almost smiled at that, but the thought passed through him too quickly, replaced by something heavier and more lasting. He glanced toward Noah, then back to Elena, and for the first time he understood that the balance of his home had shifted in a way he had not planned and could not easily reverse. She did not ask for attention. She did not demand gratitude. She simply brought steadiness into a place that had forgotten how to hold it. And as the last light from the windows thinned into evening gold, Daniel realized that the most important changes in a life did not always arrive with noise. Sometimes they entered quietly, sat beside a sleeping child, and left a man standing in his own doorway, trying to understand why his entire world suddenly felt less alone. By the time the evening had fully settled over the Whitmore house, the nursery was quiet in a way that felt almost sacred. The last of the daylight rested in pale gold across the walls, and Noah slept with one small hand curled near his cheek, breathing so softly that even the room seemed to lean in and listen. Daniel stood near the doorway, his tie loosened, his jacket gone, watching Elena move with careful ease as she tucked a blanket around the child and straightened the rocking chair beside the window. There was no performance in her kindness, no effort to be seen. That, more than anything, had begun to unsettle him. People in his world usually wanted something from him: approval, money, position, protection. Elena wanted none of it. She only wanted the child to sleep, the room to feel safe, and the house to stop holding its breath. When she noticed Daniel watching, she did not flinch or smile too quickly. She simply looked at him with the same steady composure she had carried all day, as if his attention did not intimidate her and his silence did not need to be filled. Daniel had spent years learning how to read rooms, how to measure risk in a glance, how to know when someone was lying before they had finished the first sentence. Yet this felt different. This quiet woman, with her calm hands and unhurried voice, had entered his home as a temporary answer to a practical problem, and somehow she had begun to reveal the things he had long since stopped noticing. The loneliness in a child's crying, the weight in an exhausted house, the strange emptiness that came from having every material thing and still feeling unable to breathe inside your own walls. Elena adjusted the lamp near the chair, softening the light another shade, and Noah stirred only slightly before settling again. Daniel looked from the child to the woman beside him and felt the certainty of it land deep in his chest. She had not asked to be important. She had not tried to earn a place by force. She had simply been faithful in small things, and the small things had changed everything. "He is calmer with you," Daniel said at last, his voice low, almost careful. Elena kept her eyes on the sleeping baby. "He is calmer when the room is calmer," she replied. "Children can feel what adults ignore." The words were gentle, but they stayed with him. Daniel glanced around the nursery at the folded blanket, the dimmed lamp, the peace that seemed to settle in Elena's wake, and for the first time in years he understood that strength did not always announce itself with power. Sometimes it arrived as patience. Sometimes it wore plain clothes. Sometimes it stood beside a sleeping child and quietly held together what someone else had nearly let fall apart. He had thought he was offering her work. What he was beginning to realize was that she had brought something into his life that could not be measured by a paycheck or dismissed as charity. It was steadiness. It was dignity. It was the kind of presence that made a broken home remember how to be whole. And as the house grew softer around them and the night pressed gently against the windows, Daniel stood there in the doorway, no longer certain which of them had been given rescue.